Hello, everyone. This is the Free American Press with your host, Alexander Horat. And today I'm joined by James Corbett, the independent journalist, researcher, and host of the Corbett Report. Since 2007, James has been producing documentaries, podcasts, and in-depth reports that dig into history, geopolitics, media, and the systems that shape our world. He is known for asking tough questions, challenging official narratives, and offering solutions that empower people to think critically and act locally. James, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah. James, for those who may not know you yet, can you share what inspired you to start the Corbett Report and what keeps you motivated to keep digging after all these years?
Good questions. Well, what started me in the first place was really my trip down the rabbit hole, which I'll assume many of your listeners might be able to relate to. But essentially, back in 2006, I had an experience starting to uncover information, specifically at that time about 9/11 truth, that really motivated me to start digging more and finding more information about the world because I realized I'd been lied to. Pretty significantly for much of my life by not only the media, but by the education indoctrination system, by politicians and everyone else. And so I naturally started to wonder what else I'd been lied to. And I started falling further and further down that rabbit hole. And I think what initially motivated me to start the Corbett Report was the palpable sense of the discrepancy between the information I was finding and verifying online versus the information I'd essentially been told all my life. And it was that kind of that discrepancy that made me motivated to try to share this information with other people because I knew that the information had affected me and it vastly changed my worldview. So I knew it could do the same for other people. So that was the initial impetus for me to start doing something. And since I was here in Japan, and probably not likely to go out on the street corner and start ranting in poor Japanese at Japanese people about this, I decided, well, it is the online era, so I might as well start a website. So, although I had never in my life even thought of the possibility of starting a website or starting a podcast, it suddenly became, well, this is what I have to do. And so I started doing that, and I did it for 4 years as I say part time, but actually it was more like a full time job, just one that I wasn't being paid for. For the first 4 years of the existence of the Corbett Report, I was doing it essentially on top of my regular full time job. And then I decided, well, if I'm going to do this, I might as well really try to do this. And so I started getting subscribers and uh, somehow or other managed to eke out a living for long enough. And then now I'm blessed to be supported by a very wide and vast audience, literally all around the globe, that lets me do this full time. So I guess certainly the discrepancy between the information we're fed through the mainstream media and what we can see and document for ourselves in reality, that still exists. I don't know if that's the primary motivating fuel in my engine at this point. I think what I'm attempting to do is just to try to learn more about the world and hopefully at this point, I would say that the biggest part of my mission is not just to inform people about the world, but hopefully inform people in a way that they can do something with this information, actually accomplish something, hopefully improve their lives. Because if we aren't aimed at that, what are we really aiming at? It's great to know the truth and to uncover secrets and what have you, but at a certain point, I think if that isn't aimed towards actually doing something positive with your life, it's probably wasted effort.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, and I think that's great how you started your show by asking questions and trying to find out the truth. I think we definitely need more people to do that. So that brings me to my next question. How has your perspective shifted since you began? Are there things that you believed early on that you see differently now?
I would say the most obvious difference is when I started the Corbett Report, I was a statist, and now I am not. And so, for people who aren't familiar with that terminology, essentially, I believed, at the very least, we need better government. We just need to reform the government. We need the right people in the positions of governmental power, and we can return to some ideal era in which politicians worked for the people or something along those lines. So back when I started, I was apt to tell people to, as being a Canadian, I would tell them to write their member of parliament, to tell them that you don't like this or that or what have you. These days, I now realize that it is those centralized positions of power that are themselves not just part of the problem. They are actually manifestations of the problem itself. The problem is centralized control over our lives, and we're not going to vote our way out of that at the ballot box. I don't think we're going to revolt our way out of that with the ammo box either, as some internet keyboard warriors would like to have it. I think what the only thing that will really make a difference is the evolution, revolution of consciousness that will allow people to understand this system, how it is being controlled, and how we can work together. Because ultimately, I think the entire system is predicated on our participation in it. One tiny example of that is where does where does wealth really come from? Well, it depends how you define wealth. But if you're talking about those pieces of paper that more or less act as money in our economy, although increasingly it's all digital, isn't it? But even so, where does that money come from? Well, it grows on trees, ha ha ha. No, actually, it's created by a central bank. Through what process? How did they get the power to do this? When you really drill down on it, you find that the vast majority of money in the economy is created through the commercial banks as loans that are taken out by average people trying to pay their bills and start a mortgage or start a new business. And it is based on the back of their promise to repay that loan eventually over so many years that that money is created by the virtue of the bank charter. And so ultimately, when we start to drill down on it, we find, well, actually, the productive wealth creation of the economy and everything around us really is from the back of our labor, our blood, our sweat, our tears, our promise to pay it back to these banksters who were given the power to invent, to create money out of nothing because, uh, why exactly? And once we start to drill down on it, we realize, oh, it is us. We are the ones that are really creating this world, and they're just parasiting on top of us. So why don't we get rid of that layer of obstruction and actually do something productive for ourselves, creating the world that we want? And once we put it in that framework, I think that's really the step forward. That's the way that we can envision creating a better world. And so ultimately, yes, it is us, not the politicians, who are going to get us out of this crisis.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. So it definitely starts at an individual level, it seems. So, like, how do we get rid of this centralized state of control and what would replace that? And what can we do on the individual level for ourselves to start getting better positioned in that way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because, of course, it's an incredibly overwhelmingly vast question that permits of millions of answers, not just one or two. So, what I am attempting to do at the Corbett Report is with my Solutions Watch series, I'm trying to look at various pieces of things that people can do on a day-to-day basis that will hopefully improve their lives and by extension improve their community and the world at large. And some of them could be very, very, very small pieces of advice or ideas for how to improve just tiny areas of people's lives. One example that comes to mind, I did a Solutions Watch episode on highlighter, using a highlighter, which sounds ultimately ridiculous in terms of let's, combat this overwhelming psychopathic system that's confronting us. But I have found that I am better able to retain information when I either physically highlight in a book or when I highlight online when I'm reading, highlighting passages. I am better able to retain that information, recall it, and then use it in the future. So that's a tiny, tiny little change you can make in your daily habit that over time will accumulate into potentially something more substantial. Or I also look at the big picture issues. So, for example, I've looked at simple sabotage as an example. The little things that people can do to just simply not comply, not go along with the system, throw monkey wrenches in the system, which can be everything from when you see that QR code scan to, enter here or whatever, you could change that. You take a little Sharpie and change that around enough so that it's unreadable or something along those lines. Those little acts of defiance that can be done, all the way up to things like, well, back when they were requiring you to have a vaccine certificate in order to, fill in the blank, whatever, go into this concert or whatever it is, there were doctors that were under the table selling those vaccine certificates and squirting some fake, saline solution in the sink, and no one's getting injected with anything. Those types of things can truly add up. And I just saw a case just a few weeks ago where a doctor who had done that to apparently several hundred patients, was being sued or was being potentially threatened in terms of his job, and was cleared by the Department of Justice now because it's good PR to to be against the vaccines these days. But those types of things, either really small little changes in your daily habit or really big things, the question isn't which one should I be doing? It's, hey, here's a million ideas and there are a million more. Let's try absolutely every one of them, find what works, discard the rest, and keep moving forward. I think that's the way we should be approaching this.
That definitely makes sense. A multi-pronged approach to all these problems that's going to help better than one solution. So I guess my next question is, once this centralized system gets rid of, what would we replace it with? What would be kind of your ideal? I know it might not be attainable in our lifetimes, but what's kind of your thought on your best solution to replace it with?
Well, I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel per se. I mean, there are certain ideas and systems that have developed over time that, because they developed spontaneously, organically from the grassroots, are actually more real than the artificially imposed top-down control that we've been subjected to. One example of that is the common law, which developed in the British legal tradition of there is not a list of laws that have been written down by the stroke of a pen of some leader that then become laws by virtue of the leader writing them down. No, law is this system that has developed over generations in a given community where it is the understanding that in this community, obviously you shall not murder, you shall not whatever, the basic ground rules are, and then all of the various details of that system and how to navigate it and what should happen in this case and what should happen in that case. Again, it doesn't mean that every single law has to be written down by a lawmaker. It is adjudicated over a series of cases over time, and that case precedent forms the common law, which then essentially governs the area of that community. And that seems to me a more organic and natural system than having a ruler who, by some magical incantation ritual of casting paper ballots or something, becomes the ruler of a geographical area, and anything he writes down with the stroke of his pen becomes the law. That seems to me to be a sick and twisted perversion of what that law actually is. So I think there are a lot of ways we can imagine a system without centralized. I won't even say leadership, because leadership is not in and of itself inherently bad, but centralized authority, centralized power, the king or whatever that presumes to rule over an area. I think there are more natural ways that we could imagine systems of governance arising without a government and without a single governmental leader.
Yeah, that's great. So what would be a kind of a system for you that you think would be good?
Well, it would have to be predicated on voluntary exchange. And voluntary exchange, again, this will be, I would assume, adjudicated differently in different communities. But to me, that means consenting adults can absolutely consent to exchange in whatever way they like, as long as what they are doing does not affect some third party in some other way, which also means, of course, by virtue of that third party rule, that some third party does not have a say in the transaction between me and whatever consenting human being I'm interacting with. There is no man wearing a magical cap or badge or whatever that can step into that transaction, which means that taxation, of course, is, if not theft, at least extortion.
Yeah.
Because the reason people are paying it is because of the threat of the gun that is always pointed at their head. And so I'm, I think the thing that people have a hard time understanding about what I am proposing is that this does not mean that there could not be various centralized services, even all the way from who will build the roads, all the way up to what do we do with criminals and murderers and what have you. There can be those types of institutions that already exist in society, could exist in a free society. The difference being that no one would have the gun pointed at their head as an extortionate way of paying for those things. So that, for example, if I don't think it's a good idea for my government to be stockpiling, weapons for invading Iran or whatever silly agenda item the neocon, neolib would-be rulers have on their agenda list, I wouldn't be forced to pay for that by threat of the gun pointed at my head to extort the taxes out of me. I would get to choose. Well, I think national defense is a good thing. We probably should have national defense, and I'd be willing to fund this particular project, or I'd be willing to fund that, but I'm not willing to fund that offensive war. And I think that would be one way of imagining a world in which freedom can pertain even as these things that people think are absolutely essential to their existence can still be maintained, just not by the threat of extortion.
I think that's great. I think that's a really freedom orientated economy, and I think that's the way things should be. So thank you for your insight on that. So let's move on to some geopolitical events. So, what are your thoughts on the Charlie Kirk assassination?
Well, my hot take on that is that whatever that was, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I had heard the name Charlie Kirk, and I was vaguely aware of his existence. I knew of Turning Point USA because for some reason or other, I ended up on their mass spam emailing list. Who
Hmm.
knows how that happened, but at any rate, I certainly didn't sign up for it. So I do see their emails and immediately delete them on a pretty much a daily basis. But I have never devoted 2 seconds of thought in my entire life to Charlie Kirk. I've never actually listened to him speak. So I think if I suddenly, after his assassination, oh, I've got to spend all my time studying every frame of every available scrap of evidence so that I can find out what really happened to this Charlie Kirk, that to me seems like my cognitive liberty is being infringed, that I am being steered, manipulated toward focusing my time, energy, and attention on something that I have never, ever in my life devoted my time, energy, or attention to. So I am sure there's all sorts of interesting things, and I'm sure if you look at frame 57 of this particular video, you can find, oh my God, there's a ripple in his shirt or whatever. Great. I'm glad people are out there who are interested and are delving into that, but it ain't me. I am really and truly not affected by this in any way, shape, or form, not interested in it. It could and presumably will have important effects on at the very least, the political conversation in the United States, and whether that conversation becomes more violent or not, simply because it has so utterly dominated the national conversation there for the past couple of weeks. But I'm not American. I'm a Canadian in Japan. So again, I feel utterly distanced from that story, and so I have nothing of any sort of insight to say about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Your time is important. I'm in America, so I guess it's more important towards me.
Yep.
So that brings me to my next questions, also in regards to the USA. So why is the USA facilitating so many wars and possibly starting a new war in Venezuela?
Why indeed? Well, this is actually something that I posited recently in a speech that I made in Malaysia to a conference that was commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Kuala Lumpur Declaration on the criminalization of war. So 20 years ago, a number of people, including Michelle Chossudovsky of Global Research and several other people, came together in Kuala Lumpur at the behest of the former Malaysian Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, to sign a declaration simply stating that war itself is a crime. Aggressive war is a crime and should be prosecuted as such, which really I would not say is a morally unbelievable, amazing thing. It seems actually quite basic common sense. Yes, if you commit active, aggressive war against another state, you should be prosecuted as a criminal. Great. Um, of course, unfortunately, as I had opportunity to observe in my speech at that 20th anniversary event, the last 20 years, we have not seen that principle being adopted. In fact, quite the opposite. We've seen the invasion of Libya, the destruction of Syria, the bombing of Iran, the bombing of Yemen, all sorts of despicable and horrific acts of warfare have been waged in the past couple of decades. And lo and behold, every single time people go to the ballot box, they think that they are voting for a different way. For example, obviously, after the craziness and the horrors of the Bush era war of terror, people voted en masse for Barack Obama because Mr. Hope and Change was going to come along and steer us out of those wars and change things. He won the Nobel Peace Prize before doing anything in office simply because his name was not George W. Bush.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, he ended up expanding that war of terror. For example, immediately starting drone bombings in Pakistan, expanding into Syria, of course, Operation Timber Sycamore, and all of that craziness. So people voted for less war and got more war. In the exact same way, Trump appeared on the scene in 2016 saying NATO's outdated and we don't want them anymore, and all these stupid wars in the Middle East, and the Bushes were idiots for the Iraq War, and all of these things that people wanted to hear. So they voted again for someone who's going to stop all these wars. And again, Trump's name being floated for Nobel Peace Prize, despite the fact that, of course, well, he bombed Iran, bombed Yemen. He's talking about full scale war with Venezuela.
Yeah.
What's going on? It's almost as if every single administration continues the same foreign policy, no matter who is sitting in the Oval Office, which I hope would give people pause for thought as to whether or not the person sitting in the Oval Office really matters, or if they are a figurehead for a larger agenda. I tend to think, given the decades now of research I've done on the matter, they are a figurehead for a larger agenda. And that larger agenda is about, it's not difficult to comprehend. It's essentially the same agenda that has existed throughout time immemorial, all of human civilization. A small group of people, a clique of oligarchs, want to rule as much of the earth as they can, and they will use military force to do so. That's the same story that has existed since, I don't know, the Roman times and before. And it's the same system that exists today. So it's not difficult to parse why psychopathic leaders, and specifically leaders of the unipolar, unquestioned superpower of the world, would want to use that military power to expand their wealth and influence. But here we are, and all I can say is, well, it looks like the voting solution is probably not going to work. People are not going to vote themselves towards anti-war.
Right. Yeah, we can't count on a savior. We just need to do it individually and try to stop this. I guess that begs the question from what you were talking about is what is the larger agenda? Who are these people behind Trump and all these different American leaders, and what is their end goal?
There are various ways to posit what is really at the top of the pyramid, and I'm not going to proclaim that I'm going to answer that question definitively here on today. Okay, guys, here it is. Here is the actual, because of course I have heard many, many, many different explanations for that, and some of them are more plausible than others. I don't think any of them are totally convincing. I think the most convincing thing the piece of received wisdom that I've ever heard is that if you know the people's names, they're probably not at the top of the pyramid. They're
Yeah.
probably some level of gopher or in between or something. But we can find different ways of trying to at least put a finger on it. And for example, I always go back to David Rothkopf, who was the head of Kissinger and Associates for some time, the editor of foreignpolicy.com, part of the Beltway establishment, certainly an insider, who wrote a book in, I want to say 2007, 2006 perhaps, called Superclass, in which he identified about 6,000 people who he said and bragged and openly talked about, well, these people are above the national political level. They are able to institute an international policy and get it enacted, despite the fact that they're not sitting in government necessarily. They're not actually government employees, but they are able to enact this international agenda. So that would be a good place to start and to look at organizations of influence like the Trilateral Commission, like the Bilderberg Group, like these other things that we can identify. But then, of course, there are lots of splinter groups. I don't think it's a monolithic conspiracy. I don't think everyone who is sitting at a table of power is simply following orders from above and following some script slavishly. No, I think what brings these people together is at base their ideology, their idea that centralized power and control is good. And oh, by the way, me and my friends should be the ones in those positions of power. And I have no doubt that there's a lot of backstabbing and jockeying for position that goes on so that some people want to control USA Inc. and some other people say, no, you shouldn't control that. We should control it. But at the end of the day, exactly like the mafia fighting with each other, yes, of course, they'll fight with each other and kill each other and assassinate and whatever. But if somebody comes along to threaten the racket itself, they will band together to make sure that opposition is eradicated. So I think that's the level of what we're dealing with here. It is an ideology. And when it is an ideology that you're facing, rather than a specific identifiable person or group, if we just, it would be so much easier if it was an identifiable person, because then you just get rid of that person, problem solved. Yay, happiness, sunshine, rainbows. Does anyone think that that is the way that this will operate? If you just find that person at the top of the pyramid, or even that group, and get rid of them, then everything will. No, I don't think so, because since what we're dealing with is not a person, but an ideology, and there are many, many people who hew to that ideology, if you get rid of the person or group at the very top of the power pyramid, there will be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe millions of people who would be rushing to get into that vacated seat of power. What we have to do is fundamentally undermine the ideological drive itself and present the, I think, more natural, more human, less psychopathic view of the world, the freedom view of the world, rather than venerating centralized positions of power and hoping that we can get our guy into that position of power. It is the ring from the Lord of the Rings. No one can wield it. The only thing that can be done with it is it can be thrown into the fires of Mordor and destroyed forever.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I think they make a good argument on that. So another thing that we've been seeing is stable coins. Been seeing the United States pass the Genius Act. So I just want to get your thoughts on stable coins and what they're going to be used for.
Yes, well, hopefully your audience is familiar with CBDC, the central bank digital currency that's obviously been proposed by central bankers in recent years as a new way of issuing central bank liability. So the way that it works in our current system is, yes, there are expressions of central bank liability, like, for example, Federal Reserve notes, those pieces of paper that you might carry around in your wallet if you're an American citizen. But those are untrackable, untraceable. I mean, they go around the economy. The central bank has no idea when you are using it or where you are using it. They just know when it ultimately returns back to them. And it's a very inefficient system for would-be controllers of the world. So, of course, we saw Augustin Carstens and others lusting after this idea of a central bank digital currency, where the central bank is issuing these digital currency perhaps into a wallet. Maybe you get a wallet directly with the Federal Reserve, and they give you central bank digital currency, and you spend that, and they can see every single transaction as it is happening in real time, and add any stipulations onto those transactions that they want. They can, for example, if they don't like you, you haven't been a good citizen, you haven't taken your 87th booster, they could turn it off and you would not be able to spend those CBDCs. Now, everyone, I think, it seems to me quite obvious that people who are concerned about freedom are concerned about CBDCs. However, stable coins are not CBDCs. Stable coins are issued by private issuers, private companies, not by the government. Therefore, this is the freedom solution. So yes, digital currency is a good thing. It certainly makes things a lot easier and uh, international exchange facilitated, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, maybe we do need that. But let's do the stablecoin version rather than the central bank digital currency version. However, unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the stablecoin version may even be in some ways worse than the CBDC. At the very least, people understand the CBDC threat if they are at all concerned about freedom and privacy. But people may not be as concerned about stablecoins because, again, these are private companies, so it doesn't matter. They're not the government. However, as you mentioned, the Genius Act that just passed, what that does is create a legal framework in the United States and by proxy pretty much around the world that any stablecoin that is going to be predicated on US treasuries, for example, is going to have to play by US government rules. And there are a number of ways that they can now enforce that, including, of course, leaning on their supervisory roles with the Treasury, etc., to make sure that these companies will hand over whatever data that the government wants at any time. So yes, they're private companies, but they are now that they are beholden to this law, they are essentially arms of the government. And we've already, I mean, that's not a theoretical thing. We've already seen that with, for example, Ripple and others having given information over to the U.S. Treasury about accounts, about data of people using XRP. So it has already happened. It will act. It's now just hard coded into law, and so the stable coins is really just CBDC on steroids at this point. At any rate, certainly for any company that is legally operating in the U.S., it means that they are beholden to the U.S. government and essentially just acting as an arm of Uncle Sam.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Stable coins seem like a trap. Uh, and it makes me look at gold and silver and the price. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on gold and silver for use and freedom, and your thoughts on the price that it's going to get.
Yes. Well, I would recommend if people haven't checked it out yet. I did a podcast a few years ago now on a survival currency, in which I went through a number of possible solutions to the currency problem. And among that, of course, precious metals, because precious metals have served as mediums of exchange for thousands of years and have retained their value for that amount of time. That is obviously something that cannot be said about any fiat currency that has ever existed on the planet. So there is definitely something to be said about the utility of precious metals. Having said that, there are things to be said that are downsides of precious metals, like walking around on the street carrying around your gold purse may not be the best way of facilitating exchange for a stick of bubble gum, or for sending a gold coin halfway around the world to purchase something from someone, on the other side of the world may not be the best way. So my viewpoint is, yes, I think gold and silver are great investments if you want to look at it that way. They certainly could and should be more actively used in exchange, and I'm glad to see things like the gold backs idea and other such things helping to facilitate those types of transactions. But like the solutions idea in general, I wouldn't put all of my eggs in the gold and silver basket. I think there are many different ways that people can imagine facilitating exchanges that does not rely on stable coins or fiat issued money. And we should be looking and exploring every single one of them. And maybe you decide, no, gold and silver are the only ways that I'll ever trade. And if that works for you, great. I wouldn't stop you. But for some people, they might decide, well, I want to do some transactions like this and some transactions like that. So I think it's worth exploring the different possibilities.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think not keeping your eggs not in just one basket is will help stop risk. So I think that's a good idea. Uh, so we see this war in Gaza. It's gone pretty bad. I just want to get your thoughts on the politics of it and where you think it's going, if there's going to be peace anytime soon over there.
It is hard to imagine how we get from here to peace anytime soon, because obviously the situation is so intransigent at this point. The Israeli government, as far as I have seen, certainly under Netanyahu, has shown absolutely no sign that they will stop or have any intention of stopping until essentially ethnic cleansing has taken place. So at this point, I'm not sure exactly what could stop, because of course the fig leaf of a pretense of justification for what is going on in Gaza right now is Hamas, and they're hiding in their enemy tunnels underground. So really, if the justification is that, then well, Israel is justified in killing every single last person in Gaza as long as they can make sure they kill every last Hamas fighter. And that when that is the officially held position of the Israeli government, as it is at the moment, then I don't see any way of this stopping anytime soon. Let's put it that way. And then you can get into the real questions of, well, okay, what is Hamas and where did it come from and who was really funding it and why were they funding it, etc. If people are interested in that, I did write an editorial about that last year about Hamas and where they came from and what the real story is behind them. I don't think there is any intention of fundamentally getting rid of Hamas because, again, they make a wonderful boogeyman essentially for Israel to use as their justification for their ethnic cleansing that they're currently partaking in. So, no, I don't see any swift end to this anytime soon. One could imagine, I mean, we're starting to see, for the first time in my lifetime, we're starting to see that the overall narrative about Israel and what they are doing in Gaza and the West Bank is starting to change. And suddenly people are allowed to question what is happening over there without being vile anti Semites and what have you. Although, of course, they still try to throw that rhetoric out there, but it's having less and less effect. And we see the dramatic walkout at the UN, and we see more countries recognizing the Palestinian state, etc. So there are changes that are happening, but I don't think fundamentally anything is going to change unless and until, at the very least, oh, I don't know, maybe the US stops supporting them with billions of dollars in military aid per year. When that happens, then maybe Netanyahu would be forced to actually change course. But until that happens, I think it's going to continue pushing forward in this direction.
So why do you think Netanyahu wants to do ethnic cleansing in Israel?
Well, there are a number of reasons for that. Just from a crass political calculus perspective, I'm sure that he understands that a large part of the support for the Likud and his party comes from a very vitriolic right-wing base who, in that country, is very, very invested in the settler idea of essentially ethnic cleansing, that there are settlers who are uh, pretty open about the fact that that's what they desire. And to the extent that Netanyahu can play into that, again, just from a crass political perspective, it will play out better for him. Because let's not forget, before this, he was not only under investigation for years, criminal prosecution for all of his shady political shenanigans, but also we started to see the mass protests that were developing in Israel over the past several years about his changes, for example, to the Supreme Court and other things that he was trying to implement politically. There was a lot of pushback. Now, people have rallied around the Israel flag, as they always do in times of perceived crisis. So, again, from a crass political perspective, there's that. But ultimately, I mean, what is this about? It is about Israel and essentially the Jewish state of Israel owning Israel from the river to the sea. That is the goal. In fact, this is quite explicit in various planning documents and other things that have been released over the years. There was the Oded Yunon plan from the 1980s, talking about the creation of Greater Israel and talking about the way that that would be accomplished, including such things as undermining the stability of neighboring states. And what did we see, for example, in Syria? Well, as soon as the Syrian government collapsed, Israel went and took over a large section of the Levant there. Well, of course, because that's exactly what their game plan always was. Lebanon, etc. Why are they bombing that? Again, they are trying to create the greater Israel that has been in the planning books for decades now. And I think it's closer than ever to being realized with no small help from someone like Trump, who, let's not forget, in his first administration, uh, went against generations of at least American official foreign policy by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and trying to change the status quo there just by default. So we're starting to see the end goal being in line for these types of people, and that is not a good thing. I think because again, I don't see a way out of this as long as you have someone in the Oval Office, at any rate, who is willing to support that agenda.
Yeah, I agree. And we see the Russian-Ukrainian conflict going on as well. So do you think these are just mafias fighting each other like the Russian government is fighting NATO and the US proxy? Or do you think they're all really working together towards the same goal?
I'm going to say yes, as in yes. These are mafias that are fighting with each other. And yes, I think there is a larger agenda that we can see at play in which there are forces that act on both sides. That is not a mutually exclusive possibility. So, what I mean by that is, I don't think Putin and Zelensky are actually good pals, drinking beers behind the scenes and laughing it up with each other. I think there is genuine animosity and genuine conflict that is taking place there. But I think that conflict is being engineered and ginned up from a higher plane, as it were, than the 2D version of geopolitical chess that we see going on. So I've written about this, for example, in my book, Reportage, about 3D chess and how that works. But essentially, the idea is if there is an oligarchy that sits above the nation state system, like, say, that 6,000 people identified by Rothkopf as the superclass, then they might have an interest in playing two different sides against each other. And it certainly wouldn't be the first time in history that we've seen that taken place. For example, the Cold War. Of course, you had the US versus the Soviets. Until you start looking into the technology transfers, for example, that enabled the Soviet Union to become what it was, till you start looking at the Lend-Lease program and the ways that the Soviet economy was propped up during times where it could not possibly have functioned by itself. It was propped up by the West. The Gorky automotive plant and other things that were literally been built by American engineers with American technology. So you had Ford issued tractors, etc., being converted into tanks and other such things for use in various conflicts against the West. And you start seeing, say, American soldiers dying in Korea at the hands of technology that was essentially American technology that had been handed over to the Soviets. What's going on? It's almost as if there is one oligarch or one class sitting atop that is actually trying to get these big powers to fight with each other, and successfully so. And why? Because, of course, at the very least, we can see what the Cold War did in the United States. It turned the United States government more tyrannical. It gave them the justification for turning the power of the state against their own citizens. The Red Scare, the commie menace. You don't, are you one of them? We need this ever expanding military budget. We need the ever expanding homeland security state in order to to counteract this threat in the exact same way that false flag terrorism, for example, worked in that exact same way. After the fall of the Soviet Union, you get the rise of Al Qaeda. And what did they end up doing? Well, of course, they facilitate all these terror attacks, which means, oh my God, we failed so spectacularly on 9/11. We have to give more power to the Homeland Security state. In fact, we have to start a Department of Homeland Security in order to watch citizens more carefully. There are obvious reasons why people in positions of power above the nation state level would be interested in powers fighting, and it's in that regard that I have been eyeing with concern the rise of China, the the rising red dragon of the 21st century. How did it get into its position of economic and political and military might? Well, I've done some extensive deep dives on that, including an episode of my podcast I did probably a decade ago at this point called China and the New World Order, looking at, again, at the specific technology transfers and economic agreements that have been used to create the economic juggernaut of China. And I did an article several years ago on China's suspiciously American arsenal, something along those lines. I can't remember the exact title, but looking at class after class of various military weaponry and or vehicles, from drones to fighter aircraft, etc., that are not just vaguely similar to U.S. designs, but actually literal copies of U.S. designs, down to the fact that even Popular Mechanics noted in this one Chinese propaganda video from the PLA Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, they had a propaganda video where they were demonstrating the incredible power of one of their new fighter jets or submarines or whatever it was, and they were displaying the actual display that they were using, the Chinese soldiers were using. The display was in English, and even Popular Mechanics was like, "Well, that's kind of strange. It's almost as if this is like American technology that they've just acquired somehow." So I think there is a concerted effort to make China into essentially the boogeyman of the 21st century. We're going to have the Neo-Cold War, which could turn into hot war and World War III. Who knows? But again, although the conflict is real and people really die, and there are people at the nation state level who really believe that they are doing their part for their country, I think there are forces above them that are puppeteering it and funding both sides.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I think they're funding both sides. What are the next steps that will happen to create the New World Order, and when do you think they will occur, such as like World War III?
Excellent question. Well, thankfully, no one has the crystal ball and nothing's written in the stars. So hopefully, what we do can actually affect the answer to this question. But having said that, since the beginning of the decade, I've been predicting that in the near term, what we were going to see was the introduction of digital ID. In the midterm, we were going to see the introduction of CBDC, and in the long term, hot war. And I think that prediction is panning out more or less. As we have talked about, the CBDC stablecoin kink in the narrative has taken place, but it's essentially a similar system. But digital currency being predicated on a digital ID, in which we will, of course, need to prove to the government at all times who we are, which will also give them the way of tracking everything we do and everything we say and everything we are. And we're starting to see that happening, obviously, most dramatically now with Europe and now other places rolling out the various forms of online age identification, which, of
Yeah.
course, is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from full on digital ID. And, of course, just this week, we saw Prime Minister Starmer there in the UK announcing that by, what was it, I can't remember, 2029, 2030, whatever it is, you will need a government issued digital ID to work in the UK. They are going full on with this system. So I think the digital ID is rolling out as the basis for what will be a digital currency, which will be turned on and off as the would-be rulers so deem fit. And once that system is in place, perhaps that's all they need. But unfortunately, if we do look at historical events, and if we look at the vast sweep of history, generally speaking, when there are extremely destabilizing monetary events like changeover in the world monetary reserve currency, that's generally almost always it happens in conjunction with mass geopolitical instability and war. So, I mean, for example, World War One, and we had the international gold standard. And as the world started to go off of that, and the Bank of England stopped becoming the determiner of global geopolitics and economics, we started to see the transfer, the changeover to the U.S. As the economic global juggernaut, and that transition took place over World War One/World War Two. And I think if we're going to see a similar transition in the 21st century, it very, very, very likely could be a World War III transition. That is, I think, the ultimate nightmare scenario. Because as much as people rally around the flag in times of crisis, like the October 7th in Israel, well, can you imagine that, but on an international scale, global scale, with whatever, not even thermonuclear war, but whatever kind of crazy, insane technology is being worked on behind the scenes right now to make warfare even more bloody and devastating? Can you imagine how much people would be, especially in our generation of people who have been more or less pampered throughout their lifetime, how much they would clamor for the security and stability, anything, just make it go away. Global government or whatever would certainly be on the table in such an event, which is why I think World War III is something that we should be actively working to avoid. I know that doesn't seem like it should be a controversial statement, but unfortunately, people get so ginned up by war rhetoric and get so on board and sometimes invest their identity in various politicians. And that politician wants war. Okay, yes, I voted for this. I voted for war against Venezuela or whatever the case may be. I voted for more, weaponry to Ukraine. Wait, that's exactly what I voted against. That's what Trump is doing, but somehow it all makes sense in my head. I don't know, whatever. People will unfortunately be led along. So I think we have to keep our eye on the real issue here, which is we are being manipulated into war, and we cannot let that happen on a global scale because that would ultimately, I think, change everything.
So how do you think we can stop that in time?
Once again, I think people underestimate the extent to which our participation is necessary for the functioning of the war machine and everything else. But specifically, let's start with the war machine, at least at this point, at least until they unveil the totally autonomous drone army or whatever, which probably isn't presumably that far in the future. But at any rate, at this point, they still need human soldiers to go off and fight and die on foreign battlefields. And they still need people, at the very least, maintaining and servicing and providing those weapons of warfare, even if they do become autonomous. And they need all of the ancillary people working in all of the ancillary industries, etc., to go along with that agenda. And people, essentially, at the very least, to just go along with it. Okay, well, we marched for a couple of days against war in Iraq. They went to war in Iraq anyway. Okay, well, whatever. We can't do anything. Might as well stop. General strikes and other such things could have a truly profound effect on the economy, on changing things. People are starting to realize that, even when it comes to targeting Bud Light with a boycott or whatever, and oh, we got them to change their advertising policy. Well, imagine if we were using those types of concerted, strong, boycottish tactics against the government, if there were general strikes and mobilizations against this, if people en masse refused, for example, to deploy to Iran or wherever they're being sent next, what would happen? At the very least, something would happen, and we could deflect the agenda, if not derail it entirely. So, again, I think people underestimate the amount of power that we have simply by saying no, simply by not cooperating and refusing to go along with orders from on high.
That's definitely true, James, and I appreciate your insight on that. My final question is if you could tell the audience about your school.
Ah, yes. My school. Oh, right. Yes, it's debatable whether it is a school. It certainly isn't an accredited institution, but for people who don't know, I have a website called opensourceeducation.online. And what that is the collection of some of my most important reports into an educational curriculum. So there are six subjects that you can start studying at opensourceeducation.online. I've just added the psychology course in addition to economics, history, politics, literature, and science. I always forget science for some reason. And so I've organized some of my reports. I've been, as I say, I've been doing this for nearly 20 years now, and I have reports on all manner of subjects. But I found for many years I struggled to define what it is I do, what I am. Am I a podcaster? Is that a profession? Okay, I guess. But I finally decided, no, I'm an educator. Essentially, that is what I am trying to do. I'm trying to educate people about things that I think are important. And that's reflective of my background. I was a teacher here in Japan for many years, so I think that it does fit. And so when I contextualize it in that way, I can start to see, oh, this is a curriculum essentially, and you can study this subject, and you can study this subject, and you can study that subject. So if you go to opensourceeducation.online, you can start browsing through and the various subjects, and all of that is just essentially links to reports that I've done at the Corbett Report. So they're all available 100% totally completely for free. And there is no course of study. There's no tests. There's no specific assigned reading that you have to do or anything. These are just lessons, video, audio, textual, that you can browse to your heart's content to learn more. And if you are interested in supporting this and also to get an actual physical download of all of these lessons, you can purchase them at newworldnextweek.com. But as I say, it's all up for free at opensourceeducation.online.
Well, that's great. I'm going to just share the website of the Corbett Report so people can see it and go to it. Uh, at first, if you don't succeed, they have a lot of great videos here and newsletters and documentaries. I think you just made a new documentary not too long ago. There's some other stuff for everyone to see.
That's right. It's called Descent into Madness, and it's about the pathologization of political dissent.
Yeah, that's great, and I think everyone should check out his new documentary. And I would just like to thank you, James, for being on the show and providing all this information to us.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, James.